Chapter 22. You really think those things are going to fucking invade just because I killed one of them in self-defense? Schaefer asked as he pushed aside yet another overhanging giant fern. The two men had been slogging through the jungle for hours, arguing off and on. Schaefer's suggestion that they at least try riding the mules had been vetoed as making an escape attempt too easy. They had heard a copter overhead at one point, but had been unable to see it through the canopy, and the sound had faded away again. Schaefer had looked at the guide, who had just shrugged and kept walking. Apparently that hadn't been their intended pickup. "We don't know what they're going to do," the guide said, "but we don't expect them to just ignore it." "So why didn't they just blow us all away when Dutch waxed one of them 8 years ago?" "Because it blew itself up," the guide said. "They must have thought that your brother bought it in the explosion. He damn near did." "Or maybe they figured their buddy knew the risks," Schaefer suggested. "Come on, Schaefer," the guide said. "These things are from another planet. They've got starships and shit. They may be 1,000,000 years ahead of us. You think they're going to let a bunch of apes like us blow away tourists?" "Why not?" Schaefer asked. "You seem to think we should let them blow away our people. Wasn't that what was happening in New York? Let the boys have some fun, and so what if they kill a few of the natives?" "Better they take out a few than the whole lot of us," the guide said. "Better they not take out any," Schaefer replied. "A point I was trying to make when I came down here looking for that son of a bitch." "Oh, right. Did you really think you could waltz down here and just end it as easily as that?" Schaefer didn't reply, and the guide went on. "You're not in Kansas anymore, pal. You can't roust these guys like your standard-issue gangbangers or drug pushers." The sound of a rifle shot interrupted the guide in mid-word, and Schaefer turned, startled, to see blood spurt from the man's shoulder. "Pushers," the guide said, swaying unsteadily, trying to bring the auto shotgun around, trying to locate the source of the shot. Schaefer didn't wait for any more surprises. He dived for cover, throwing himself as far from the guide and the mules as he could. As he hit the ground, the jungle erupted in gunfire. The guide tottered and went down. Schaefer listened, looked at the shots he could see hitting, and counted at least 4 shooters concealed in the jungle, all within 30 yards. One of the mules went down, a stupid waste in Schaefer's opinion, but he wasn't about to try and do anything about it. He lay still, half hidden in ferns, and waited for the shooting to stop. At least whoever was shooting was using ordinary guns and not that high-intensity alien shit. This wasn't the revenge of the invaders from space that the phony guide had been so worried about. Small consolation, Schaefer thought. The poor son of a bitch was just as dead as if he'd caught the aliens' fireworks in the chest. He shifted, very slowly, very carefully, turning to see what was happening. The firing trailed off and stopped. The guy didn't so much as twitch. He was pretty clearly dead. The downed mule was still kicking, though, and a man in green fatigue stepped out of the bush, put a gun to the animal's head, and snapped off a single, final shot. The other mule had skittered off into the jungle. Schaefer couldn't see it as he watched the men appearing out of the forest. 4 of them, all right, 2 with MAC-10s, 2 with Chinese AK-47s. The choice of hardware and something about their attitude convinced Schaefer that these guys were Colombian drug cartel men. But what the hell were they doing here? This place wasn't on the regular smuggling routes, so far as Schaefer knew. Maybe they'd shifted their routes again, though. The DEA and the local policia might have done that much. One of the gunmen lifted the guide's head and looked at the bloody, mud-smeared face. "Este marrano está muerto," he said. Another, just behind the first, gave a sharp bark of disgusted laughter. "Echeverra lo quiera vivo." Echeverra. Schaefer knew a Colombian man named Echeverra. Echeverra had tried to be a big man back in New York, acted like one of those suave Miami Vice types. But as far as Schaefer was concerned, underneath the spit shine, Echeverra was just another 2-bit drug-dealing prick. Back when he and Rash had still been working narcotics, Schaefer had heard about Echeverra from a couple of underlings. Schaefer and Rash had put in some legwork trying to get something on him, something that would stick. And word must have got around. A couple of Echeverria boys had shown up with an invitation. Schaefer had gone along, just for laughs. Schaefer and Rash had met with Echeverria in the rooftop garden of a fancy Manhattan brownstone, surrounded by tropical plants that were dying of the New York cold. It had been just the three of them. The bodyguards had stayed out of sight, as a sign of trust and respect. Rash had let Schaefer do the talking. There'd been some preliminaries, each man demonstrating how tough he thought he was, and then Echeverria had spilled $1 million in small bills across the bark dust and told Schaefer that he and Rash could have it, that very day, if they'd just back off and leave him alone. And he'd had a switchblade in the other hand as a warning of what might happen if they didn't take the money. $1 million, he'd said, and Schaefer had believed him. The pile of bills hadn't been small. Schaefer had thought it over for a couple of seconds, just to be fair to Rash. $500,000 could have kept Shari and the boys comfortable for a long time. Rash wouldn't have to worry about this pension. But Schaefer had seen the look on Rash's face, and he knew that Shari would just have to put up with New York a few years more. He'd expected that. That settled, Schaefer had grabbed Echeverria and thrown the son of a bitch off the roof. Only 3 stories. Echeverria lived. And Schaefer had walked out untouched while the bodyguards were running in circles. Schaefer had reported it as an accident, said Echeverria tripped. There weren't any other witnesses. Echeverria hadn't pressed charges. He'd packed up and gone home to Colombia to lick his wounds. Schaefer had figured he'd bump into Echeverria again, sooner or later, though. The people of the Cali cartel were known to carry grudges. This wasn't quite how or where he'd expected the encounter, though. Had Echeverria's men been after him? He couldn't see why they'd want the guide in particular, or what drug dealers would have to do with aliens, so yeah, they'd probably been after him, and nailed the guide just because he was there. So how had they known he was anywhere in the vicinity? He wondered if Hansen had sold him out, told Echeverria where to look for him. It was possible, though he'd always thought Hansen was still straight. Maybe one of Phillips's men had leaked. Or it might have just been a coincidence, a stroke of bad luck. But if so, it was one hell of a coincidence. "Yo voy a mirar aquí," someone said, reminding Schaefer where he was. The gunmen were looking around now. Whether they were after Schaefer specifically or not, they apparently knew the guide hadn't been alone. Not that it was hard to figure out when there were 2 mules, and they both had saddles. They weren't being too bright about the search, though. They'd spread out and weren't watching each other. Schaefer moved slowly into a crouch, ready to spring. One of the men was approaching. Then he was right on top of Schaefer, and the detective burst up through the ferns, planting a solid right hand on the man's jaw. The Colombian went down, and Schaefer snatched up his MAC-10. By the time he'd untangled the shoulder strap from the dazed man's shoulder, though, the other 3 had turned and opened fire. Schaefer dived for cover again. He checked the gun quickly, found the magazine still half full, and returned fire. The thing wasn't very accurate. It was meant for spraying fire across an area, not for hitting targets. Schaefer didn't really expect to hit anything, but it would make the Colombians keep their heads down. Now that he'd been spotted, there was no point in staying quiet or trying to hide. He worried about cover, but not concealment, and he kept moving, cutting from one tree to the next in short dashes, spraying bullets each time. The Colombians fired back, but usually only succeeded in putting a dozen rounds through the space between trees after Schaefer had already reached cover. That didn't mean they were stupid, just human. Reaction times weren't fast enough. They didn't know when he'd move, or which way. If they'd had the firepower, they could have kept up a steady fire and pinned him down while one circled around behind. But they didn't. There were just the 3 weapons, and they'd probably shot off half their ammo taking down the guide and the mule. The one mule, the guide's mule. The other one, the one Schaefer had ridden originally, was still alive and unhurt. And Schaefer figured his best chance, his only chance really, was to get to that animal, and to the rest of the arsenal he brought up from Rio Sucio. The Colombians hadn't touched it yet. With that stuff, he could lay down enough fire to maybe take out 1 or 2 of his enemies, despite the thick jungle. and if that didn't scare the others off, it would at least keep them down long enough that he could mount up and make a run for it. He wished the damn mule would hold still, preferably behind some sort of cover. It was wandering slowly through the jungle, staying well clear of the larger trees. It didn't seem to be bothered by the gunfire, and Schaefer wondered just where the guide had got it, and how much experience the animal had had with this sort of thing. He worked his way closer to the animal, and when he thought he had a chance, he made a run for it. The mule started and shied away at his approach. Gunfire hadn't scared it, but Schaefer apparently did. "Come here, damn you," he shouted, grabbing for the bridle. He got a hand on one leather strap, and the mule pulled away, rearing slightly. "Down, damn it!" Holding the bridle with one hand, he reached for the gun box with the other, turning the mule to keep it between himself and the Colombians as he pulled out his reserve shotgun. Hansen had been generous, and Schaefer appreciated it. "All right," he said. "My turn." He lifted the weapon and froze as hard steel touched the back of his head. "Drop it, Marano," a cold voice said in his ear, "or I fear that Senor Echeverria will be deprived of his evening's entertainment." Maybe they hadn't been able to pin him down, but one of them had circled around anyway, and Schaefer hadn't heard or seen a thing. His grip tightened on the shotgun as he considered his next move, and then a gun butt hit his head with a sharp crack, and Schaefer, no longer considering anything, went down.